Good morning. So you've heard our scriptures read, and you know that today we're talking about love. So I want to ask if any of you watched the royal wedding. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. It's been a good 3 weeks ago now. I had friends who skipped half a day of work in order to be able to get up and watch this wedding. I was not that interested. All the best to the Harry and Meghan. Yeah, I even remember their names. But they're clear across the world. They don't care whether or not I watch their wedding. So I was really not all that interested until my friends who were interested started sending me the video of the pastor's sermon from the wedding. Did anybody see that? Wasn't it spectacular? It was just incredible. The pastor took this opportunity to talk about not just the love between this couple, but the power of God's love at work in the world. There was one quote that I read, where he said, one scholar said it this way: Jesus had founded the most revolutionary movement in human history, a movement built on the unconditional love of God for the world and the mandate to live that love. Imagine our world when love is the way. No child would go to bed hungry in such a world as that. Poverty would become history in such a world as that. The earth would be a sanctuary in such a world as that. We would treat one another as children of God, regardless of differences. We would learn how to lay our swords and shields down by the riverside to study war no more. There would be a new heaven, a new earth, a new world, a new and beautiful human family. Isn't that wonderful? I love that picture of what happens when we live out God's unconditional love in the world. When we are truly living out God's unconditional love for the world, things change. They change for the better. Things get better when we love with God's love. It makes sense when you say it, but obviously we're not doing so hot at it. And so it's good every once in a while to take some time to be intentional about our understanding about God's love and how we are called to live out that love in the world. Now, Jesus talked about love in his teachings to the people who listened to him, and he was talking to a group who already had a mandate about God's love. Within the law, the Jews were told in Deuteronomy to love the Lord their God with all their heart and soul and strength, and in Leviticus, they were told to love their neighbor as themselves. And they very much saw these two commandments about love as embracing all of the law itself. And so they truly believed that when they loved God and loved each other, and by each other they meant other Jews, their neighbors, then they were living out God's love for the world. And they were just fine with that. Jesus wasn't. Jesus had to change that up. Jesus had to modify how they understood God's love for the world, or else they wouldn't have understood his sacrifice for them. You see, by the time Jesus died for them, they had made themselves his enemy. They had chosen to oppose him, to be against him. And so there's no way they could understand an enemy being loved until Jesus taught them. And so in Matthew, you heard read where Jesus taught them that you've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. Jesus was teaching them that God loved them even when they set themselves against him. That God's love was so great for the whole world that nothing could separate them from it. Not even when they became God's enemy. And so, if they were going to live God's love in the world as God's people, they too had to love their enemies. It's important that we remember this, that we're intentional about this, that we think about who it is that we consider our enemies, and how is it that we are choosing to love them. But Jesus didn't stop there. And I think Jesus didn't stop there because he understood our infinite capacity to rationalize our actions. Right? We have, as human beings, an amazing capacity to take something evil and call it good. To take something wrong and call it right. to do the mental gymnastics it takes in order to let ourselves off the hook. I know I myself have multiple times just been terrible to somebody. And afterwards said, I'm only telling you these things because I love you, as if that makes it better. Has anybody else found themselves trying to rationalize their actions? You're human, so I'm assuming that you have. It's what we do. Jesus knew this, and so he didn't stop with just telling us to love both our neighbors and our enemies. He added on to that. He realized that we were going to need an example. We were going to need a concrete, undeniable, unrationalizable example of love. And so in John, after he's washed his disciples' feet on that night of the Last Supper, he tells them, now I'm giving you a new command. Love one another. As I have loved you, you should love one another. This is how people are going to know you're my disciples. So we're not just supposed to love our neighbors, and we're not just supposed to love our enemies. We're called to love our neighbors and our enemies as Jesus loved. So even when we want to rationalize something maybe not so loving as falling under the love umbrella, we have to hold it up against the example of Jesus and say, no, does that look like Christ? Does that sound like Christ? Think for a minute about what this means, okay? Jesus loved by touching the untouchable. In Jesus' time, the lepers were sent outside of the villages and the towns, and they were not allowed to be touched. They were not allowed to come within, so many feet of healthy people. They were utterly cut off from all of society, and Jesus reached out and touched them. Jesus accepted the unacceptable, the sinners and the tax collectors and the people others shunned and looked down on and scorned. Jesus ate a meal with them. Jesus spoke with them. Jesus rejoiced in them. Jesus embraced the outcasts. That is how Jesus loved. I want you to think for a minute. Who are the untouchables in our world? Who are those that are deemed unacceptable? Who are the outcasts? When I went to the pre-conference briefing for the annual conference that I'm at in this very moment, we got to hear the head of the prison systems in Ohio come and speak to us. And he was telling us all about the laws that are out there and how ineffective our prison system is and how broken it is. And his greatest concern with our prison system is what happens to the people who leave it when they return to society, because so often they become, and he was very clear about this, the lepers of today. They're not welcomed in our society. They're not brought back in. They can't rent a home. Nobody will rent to them. They can't get a job. Nobody will give them a job. They have family that won't speak to them. There's been no reconciliation. There's been no healing. There's been no fixing of the problems that sent them to prison in the first place. And half of them end up returning. And it breaks his heart. All of those wasted years. And then they can't reintegrate into society. They're the outcasts. And he never denied that most of them deserve to be in his prison system. He just recognizes that once they've done their time, once they've paid their debt, they're still untouchable, unacceptable, and outcast. It's one of the reasons that the United Methodist Church is now working with so many different organizations trying to help returning citizens actually be returning citizens, trying to make sure they have a home and a job and a family to go back to before they're even released from prison. It's one of the concrete ways in which the church is living out God's unconditional love, and it's making a difference better. See, that's what Jesus wants when he's teaching us about love. That's the whole point of Jesus' ministry. He came to make a difference for the better. He came to win a victory nobody else could win. He came to make it so that when we loved in his name, with his love in the world around us, it made a difference. The kingdom was brought. His victory is seen, and things change for the better. All of this means that we have to be truly intentional. We have to really think about how and why we love. You see, so often when we love others because of what it's going to get us. Okay, we love somebody so that they will love us back. All right? Or we love somebody so that they will be safe for us to be around. Or we love somebody so that they will become more like us and then be more comfortable for us to be around. We love with at least half of our motivation being what we get out of that. It's a transactional love, and that has never, ever been God's love. Instead of loving for what we get out of something, we should love because of what we've already been given. We've already been given the unconditional love of God in Jesus Christ. It has been poured into our lives and continues to pour into our lives consistently, constantly, from the moment we say yes to Christ until eternity. We don't love because of what we're going to get out of it. We love because he first loved us. And it's when we can love because he first loved us. When we can love not with an eye on what we get, but with an eye on what we've already been given. When we can love with that unconditional love that God has for the world, that's when the world changes for the better. That's when the kingdom is brought. That is when we start to be transformed, and as we're transformed, become transformative. Jesus said, "Love as I have loved." I hope you understand just how terribly difficult that is if we're doing it on our own. How frightening that command is. How difficult it is to live out. I think I've shared with you a couple of times quotes from my favorite saint. My favorite saint is Julian of Norwich. She was just a remarkable woman and had this incredible grasp on the love and grace of God. And in one of the quotes of hers that I love so much is this. She says, "Thus will I love, thus do I love, and thus I am safe." And all of a sudden, I know you're thinking, but Pastor Jamie, she's loving so that she'll be safe. No, she's not talking about a physical safety. She's talking about the safety of her resurrected, recreated self. You see, God's love is at work in us each and every day to sanctify us, to restore us to who we were created to be, to resurrect what has died within us, to clear away what shouldn't have been there at all, to make us the unique reflection of God's love that we were created to be. And that unique reflection of God's love that we were created to be is in danger in this world each and every day. We are tempted each and every day in this world to be angry and hurt and bitter and hateful and closed off instead of open. We're tempted to reject the untouchable, the unacceptable, the outcast. It's easier to do so and to just love our neighbors and to call that the love of Christ. And yet, if we can say that just like Christ loved, thus will I love, and thus do I love, then that unique reflection of God's love that we're created to be is unleashed in the world, and the world changes for the better because we have chosen to love. So I want to invite you this morning, as you go into the week ahead, to first of all allow the love of God to fill you. Know yourself to be loved. You are not an enemy of God. And even if you are, you're loved. There's nothing you've done, nothing you've said. Doesn't matter how bad the previous week was, you are loved. You are cherished by God. Let that love fill you to the overflowing so that you can go out into the world around you and live the unconditional love of God that we witness in Jesus Christ, so that the world can change, so that we can have a new heaven and a new earth and a new humanity, the very dream of God.